an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, world leaders are meeting in Paris to try and reach international agreement on reducing emissions and tackling climate change. In his speech to the conference yesterday, David Cameron said that we need global action to deal with a global problem. But closer to home, Green campaigners are angry at changes made in the summer budget and recent spending review that will reduce the subsidies available to renewable energy, once famously referred to as, quote, green crap. Not my words. Prime Minister's. Last week, Chancellor George Osborne announced that the green levies paid by consumers on their energy bills will be reduced. He also scrapped a £1 billion competition to develop carbon capture and storage technology, which would wrap up the CO2 under the ground. And he also exempted energy-intensive industries like steel from the cost of environmental tariffs, while cutting the day-to-day budget for the Department for Energy and Climate Change by 22%. This is on top of plans already announced to raise hundreds of millions in taxes from renewable energy companies, by making them pay the climate change levy. And if all that's not enough, how about cuts in the subsidies available for solar power and onshore wind? Offshore wind still gets its subsidies, not onshore. Energy and Climate Change Secretary Amber Rudd insists the government is still on course to meet its emission targets and says it is doubling funding for innovation and research in the energy industry while taking action to keep the cost of energy down. We're joined now by the former Conservative Cabinet Minister Peter Lilley. Welcome to the programme. When you see that list of changes the government has made, particularly in aid and subsidies to renewable energy, quite hard now to claim to be the greenest government ever, isn't it?
Well, it's all because they've been even greener than they intended, that they set forward a certain budget to reach a certain target for renewables, and because the subsidies were excessively generous, even by their standards, people signed up too fast, the budget was fully used up, and they were ahead of schedule in meeting their targets. Now, I'm sceptical about the whole business, but to give them credit, it's not because they want to do too little, it's because they'd already done more than they intended.
And you think there is no doubt that we meet our renewable targets?
I don't think there's any
Caroline
doubt,
Lucas?
but Caroline might give a sceptical view.
I think in the short term we will meet them.
Is that up to the 2020 target?
Yeah,
yes, I was only
but longer term it looks likely that we won't. And the idea of cutting the subsidies to solar right now is what is just so really lacking in any sense, because if the subsidies, the bit of support could have just gone on for another few years, literally 2 or 3 years, then solar would have been at a state where it would have not needed that extra support. It would have had so-called grid parity. In other words, it would have been able to compete with other fossil fuels and others at market. So just for the sake of another few years of that support, we've sacrificed a really growing industry. In my constituency in Brighton, there are now solar companies going out of work. Thousands of people are being laid off, possibly up to 20,000 as a result of this really short-sighted move by the government.
Okay. Peter Lilley, just another couple of years, it would have done the job?
It's always a couple of years. But even if they reach grid parity, as Caroline calls it, i.e. the cost of producing electricity by solar is the same as the cost of producing coal and delivering it to the grid. Unfortunately, solar delivers it only at the times we don't need it. We need it most in winter and most in the evenings. And it, you may have noticed the sun doesn't shine very much in the summer or the evenings. As a result, electricity is much less valuable at that time. To be competitive, it would have to produce at between 30 and 50% less cost than conventional fuels. And there's no chance of that in the horizon.
But Peter, you know that there are huge strides happening when it comes to energy storage, when it comes to interconnectors. And, one of the decisions that this government has taken, the most controversial, is to lock us into this huge contract with building a new nuclear power station at Hinkley Point. Now, the evidence is clearly there that that power station is going to lock us into those funds for 35 years. If you look at what solar could have done over a similar period, we would have been getting electricity far more cheaply from solar than we are now going to get it from nuclear. I
understand that on the economics, but that does presuppose that we eventually crack the storage issue. That the power that is generated by solar when the sun is shining, we can then store in sufficiently large quantities to then feed it into the grid.
it's happening now.
But it doesn't exist yet in any large scale.
But
I mean, it may one day.
We're making huge
that's quite a
breakthroughs.
big. Well, you
and
say
people
that.
are saying
we're
that
always
within 10
making
years,
breakthroughs. We're always just on the edge of things. If it was
See
so
what's happening in
close,
the
it wouldn't
States.
really matter whether we had subsidies for the next 2 or 3 years or not. But it's not remotely close. It only lists these storage things. I hope they do develop them and they become cheap. But at the moment, they're only dreams of the Greens. And they
are
don't
not
exist in the real world.
dreams
Show
of the
me
Greens.
one.
They are. If you were
Show
following
me
the
one.
Paris climate talks, they're already talking about an international group of scientists coming together to really step up their work on this. It'll be done far faster than when you get the first bit of electricity coming out of Hinkley Power Station. I'd lay a bet on it.
Well, coming back, the Hinkley Power Station, I mean, people have criticised onshore wind and particularly offshore wind for being very expensive. It's a fair bet that the Hinkley Power Station will be the most expensive power station ever built in the world, anytime, anywhere. And that's even assuming it's on time and on budget, which, given EDF and France's record on these things in Finland and in northern France, would be probably a stupid assumption to make.
I agree. I'm rather sceptical about it. I always used to be keen on nuclear energy. As a child, I decided to be a scientist because nuclear energy had been just discovered and I was going to make energy too cheap to meter, was the phrase in those days. And now it's too expensive to contemplate. It's one of those things where the assumption that costs always go down doesn't turn out to be true.
I'm delighted to recruit Peter to the anti-nuclear cause.
I'm
I'll be out there on
not
the
anti-nuclear.
barricades.
I'm in favour of it in principle, and I would certainly be in favour of looking at small modular nuclear as possibly something where, if we're going to spend a lot of money on nuclear, at least the industry will be homegrown and capable of exporting.
On the wider issue of what's going on in Paris, do you just don't really think it's important? Is that right?
It's not terribly important. And even if it achieves what it claims to achieve, the only 2 studies I've seen which have fed through all the commitments that governments are planning to make through the computers that forecast future climate. I'm sceptical about those.
The models.
Computers, those computer models. They show the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Bjorn Lomborg have both done studies. They both come out that this will mean that the world in the end of the century is 0.2 degrees cooler than it would otherwise be for the expenditure of trillions of dollars.
Okay. What do you say to that?
Well, I'd certainly say that Bjorn Lomborg is hardly an independent expert to be citing when it comes
Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
Well, I'm sure I can find you a
Bjorn
dozen
Lomborg
others
is as independent as you, me or Andrew.
Let's talk about what's happening in Paris right now, which is incredibly exciting, actually. And you don't often have me coming to say that something is good and exciting, but I am excited
we like
by
to have
Paris.
it first.
Good, because I think these are the best chances we've had of getting an agreement to keep warming as close below 2 degrees as we possibly can.
The target's the 2 degrees Celsius.
We want to keep below 2 degrees Celsius warming. At the moment, if you add up what the different countries have pledged, it's still looking more like 2.7. But the good thing is that they're going to build in a kind of a ratchet mechanism, at least that's looking likely, whereby these can be reviewed regularly so that as the science and as the technology progresses, we can also ratchet up the ambition
Will it be binding?
I fear that it will not be binding, but I know it would be
your
wonderful
side
if
of
it
the
was.
argument,
I would
that's
love
a
it.
weakness,
It is
isn't it?
certainly a weakness. However, if you compare where we are now to where we were in Copenhagen, the last set of climate talks, that disintegrated in such chaos. Now we have a good text in front of negotiators that can be improved, and we just have to hope the political will is there to do it.
Whereas Copenhagen ended pretty much without result, as chaos, I think, was the phrase you use, there are higher hopes for the Paris meeting. There is a sense there will be some kind of agreement this time.
They'll always agree to agree, but it's agree to something because it's not binding. Most countries, as they get develop, will start using energy more efficiently, and therefore they'll be able to make commitments to reduce the amount of energy per unit of GDP. China will do that automatically. It's got nothing to do with carbon dioxide. It's just using energy more efficiently and getting rid of coal pollution.
Which is what's been happening in America.
Yes, but I was going to say that I think that the fact that China and the US now are absolutely on board with these talks in a way that they weren't back in Copenhagen, the fact that businesses are lobbying... Yes, I do. I mean, China is now the biggest place for renewable energy investment.
It's also going to build 100 new coal stations.
Well, it's also doing an awful lot on renewable
100
energy,
new
which will
coal-stations is not
outweigh
a great
that.
policy to have.
It is not a great policy
because
to
not
have,
only
but
is it a CO2, it helps to create this huge smog that is currently hitting Chinese
they are
cities.
moving away from that very, very fast, not
No,
because
they're
of climate
building 100
reasons.
new ones.
Well, I would be very surprised if 100 new ones happen because of the smog, not because of what happens in Paris, but because
that
their
could
local
be true.
people are
Because
so,
particularly
they can't live in it.
People start to
Yeah.
campaign and even form a Chinese Green Party. There could be an opportunity for you there as well.
Thank you.
Very quickly on this, have you made up your mind how you will vote on the Syrian motion tomorrow?
No, I start sceptical, but I would like to be persuaded that there are credible reasons for doing what we clearly will do, but I'm not yet convinced.
You were the second one. Douglas Carswell was in the same position there. And we hear that the Prime Minister, or the Cabinet, I guess, is at last going to come to a decision on another runway in the southeast, and the money seems to be is going to be on Heathrow. What is your view on that?
We should just get on and do it. I don't particularly care where it is, but let's build it.
And
You
you
won't
would
be
be against
surprised.
a runway anywhere, I assume, in the southeast.
I would. Aviation being the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions, the fact that there are so many of the emissions that aren't captured in any of the kind of mechanisms we've got, like the emissions trading system, it doesn't work for aviation. I think basically what we need to do is to reduce demand. That means getting a lot more freight going in other ways, and it means also having there's a proposal for a frequent flyer levy. So essentially it would actually penalise people that fly a lot. It wouldn't penalise people who fly much less.
Do you think it will be Heathrow? Whether you want it or
Yeah,
not,
I'm sure
do you
it will.
think the government will go for
Yeah.
it? And in with a fight, up against Boris Johnson, up against Zach Goldsmith,
Yes.
a duo of old Etonians against Heathrow.
well,
I mean, they obviously don't want
We've
the
got more
old school to be
old
disturbed.
Etonians than they've got.
It's almost on there. Was in
The
favour of
worst
it.
idea of this government, happily now confirmed.
Exactly. All right, Peter Lilly, thank you very much.